Hey everyone, this is Jim, also known as Entelecheia. Today I am joined by Nic Laccetti to have a discussion. Yeah, Nick and I got talking on Twitter, and the conversation quickly got kind of heavy and deep, much more so than I think either of us was prepared to work out over Twitter. And in particular, we were kind of throwing around these terms and philosophical jargon and stuff, things like immanence and onto-theology and stuff. And it's these are the kinds of terms where I think it helps to kind of slow things down a little bit and break down some of the jargon and kind of get down to some basics. And I thought it might be really interesting for other people in the occult community to listen in on this conversation and maybe understand some of these terms and like kind of what's at stake in some of this stuff. I think that that can kind of be passed over when we have these sort of high level philosophical conversations. And then I got to looking at Nick's blog, and there's just so much interesting stuff on there that I really wanted to start digging into. Nick has a really interesting background. I know you got a background in Roman Catholicism and Thelema and activism and liberation theology and just lots and lots of cool stuff. And we're barely going to scratch the surface of that today, but I'm going to include all your links in the description below. So like I said, we kind of started out having this kind of high level philosophical conversation, and I kind of want to try to bring it down a little more to earth and kind of start there. And so I figure a really interesting starting place would be this issue of liberation theology, which I think is really interesting. You started talking about that, and you were talking about theology of radical immanence, which I thought was very interesting. And so I'd be curious to hear what your understanding is of that, maybe what you would contrast that with, and let's just start there and see where things go.
Sure. Yeah, and so I appreciate being on. Twitter was really fun to have those conversations, but maybe you also felt I was a little exhausted after trying to do that on Twitter.
It's tough
after a couple of days. So I'm impressed by your ability to do that more regularly. but yeah, I know. I guess to start, I should say that my training officially is more in theology, explicitly Christian theology. Like you mentioned, I have a background. I was a practicing Roman Catholic. I'm still kind of a Catholic in some way. And I've also been a Thelemite and an occultist since I was around 16. I got a copy of the Per Durabu, the biography of Crowley, when I was 16 at Barnes & Noble or something like that. So I'm 34 now. So it's been a while. But my occult interests have kind of been around the edges of the academic work in theology and kind of church history that I've done over the past couple of decades. Liberation theology for me is really I would say like the standard theological position at my alma mater, which is Union Theological Seminary in New York City, where I got an MDiv a few years back and also worked until this summer actually for many years. So liberation theology is this tradition, for folks who aren't familiar with it, that kind of comes out of the mid 20th century in Christian circles. It really comes out of a period of engagement among kind of Christians, especially lay Christians and kind of priests that are really on the edges of the church hierarchy, to really engage in social issues, including like poverty, racism, gender, sexuality. So liberation theology is usually considered part of a larger school called contextual theology, which really is theology emerging out of specific contexts. The ones people know most probably are the Latin American liberation theologians. Usually those come out of a Catholic context, like Gustavo Gutierrez in Peru. And then in the United States, James Cone, who's the founder of Black liberation theology, who's also my professor at Union, is a major figure. So that's kind of where I'm coming from. That's this sort of standard theology in the mix that kind of emerged out of my school. And then, through that, I was involved with social justice organizing, explicitly kind of faith-based social justice organizing for the past 8 or so years. I was working full-time for the last 5 years. So while doing all that, I was also doing occult work kind of on the side and when I had time, which wasn't that often until more recently. And one of the things that I kind of saw while, I didn't explicitly set out to do kind of mix occultism and any of that liberation theology, but it was just impossible based on the context of the work I was doing not to try to see, what do these occult ideas have to do with the world. So I think one of the things in liberation theology that, Christians have started to engage with is this idea that the biblical text and theology actually have to have something to do with your, material well-being as a human being and, your culture and your society. So, reading occult texts, like when I had spare time, it's kind of like, I don't want to just be an escape from, what I was doing the rest of my life. So that's kind of where that started. So I kind of developed thinking about it through that. Don't know if that answered the question, but that's where it comes from, I guess.
Yeah, no, that's really fascinating. So, I mean, how did you, Roman Catholicism is already kind of has some spooky elements to it, perhaps as compared with other, I was raised Roman Catholic as well. Yeah. And so you're kind of inundated with, like The Exorcist and similar movies and stuff, and fear of the occult and stuff. But like the occult is largely frowned upon in mainstream Roman Catholicism. So, I mean, how did you that must have, was that something that you were kind of keeping under wraps, or just like,
so the interesting thing about that, I feel like, and it's much more common now, there's like clearly a Roman Catholic occult revival going on that's pretty significant in terms of like social media, and there's a few churches that have been founded based on those ideas now. I would say that I did kind of research a lot of that. So if you read like Eliphas Levi, other people, they're all very Catholic in some ways, especially the French occult tradition. So I did find that useful when I was trying to reconcile them in some extent. But the interesting thing about this for me is really that the type of Catholic theology that feeds into liberation theology is much more modernist than I think a lot of the theology that feeds into Catholic occultism in a lot of ways.
How would you compare those? That's interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that, one of my professors at Union is well known. His name is Roger Haight. He was actually banned from teaching by the Vatican. So that's why he ended up where I went to school. Because the school that I went to is a non-denominational, mostly Protestant seminary. It's not Roman Catholic. In the 20th century, there's been these movements of kind of modernist and liberal Catholics, and that kind of feeds into liberation theology directly. For those people kind of in the wake of Vatican II, especially, a lot of the kind of devotional forms, like the old Latin Mass, some of the kind of popular religion are not really the primary influence anymore, though there's been ways to reinterpret it. If you go to like a Catholic church nowadays and it looks very modern, a lot of that kind of architecture comes out of this movement around the time of the Second Vatican Council, and liberation theology kind of comes out of that milieu as well. So I would say that, explain a little clearer, like aesthetically, I feel like some occultists are really into, and I'm pretty into it too, like some of the old forms of like the Latin Mass and saints and all that. A lot of the modern Catholic theologians I know who are into liberation theology are really not into that stuff. They're much more likely to read like Adorno or Marx and stuff. And so that is a very different approach. And part of that came out of kind of Marxist liberation movements in South America in the 20th century, that they were much more engaged with that on a popular level than necessarily with popular religion. So I don't know if that maybe opens a can of worms, but it almost is like two different streams. The Catholic occultism on the one hand, and then this kind of, this other type of theology is almost speaking in different languages to some extent. So that I wouldn't even say that liberation theology and some of the types of Catholic occultism totally fit together, but though I think you could probably do an interesting attempt to reconcile them. But I guess really quickly, the question about whether I had to hide it. My family is not explicitly religious. That's the other aspect. So, I was raised in I'm half Italian. So I was raised in a kind of Catholic like culture growing up. But, it wasn't, my dad's more into gambling than going to mass. I would say he's probably going to listen to this or something. So he'll probably be annoyed by that. But, it's not a big part of my family. So when I was like 16 and got into Crowley and Wicca and all that kind of stuff, that nobody really discouraged that. It was kind of the 90s occult revival, which feels now way smaller than the one that's happening now, but was a thing if you watch Buffy in like 1997. So, so I would say that's probably where it comes from.
So, I mean, the way that you describe the difference between the modernist theology versus this other theology, which you see as being more attached to occultism. You described it somewhat in aesthetic terms, but I'm kind of interested to dig more deep into it. Like, what is like? How would you characterize the theology that's attached, that surrounds, or is attached or associated with the occult framing? Because I was aware of Levy's background, but I'm maybe not everybody. I'm definitely not aware of like maybe what all his theological beliefs were or how that impacted his occult work.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that a lot of the forms of Catholic occultism that are kind of gaining in popularity right now, because they're kind of rooted in this traditional Catholic devotional culture. And this kind of goes back to kind of connected back to what we were talking about at the beginning, which is transcendence and immanence. A lot of those are, and I think Levy as well, have some sense of kind of a transcendent deity. And so, you know, there's like a popular Platonism almost that goes into a lot of these ideas. So in terms of the cult of the saints, like the Virgin Mary, a lot of that is based off of, you know, mediators in kind of a spirit world, though traditional Catholics wouldn't call it that, kind of mediating between you and a transcendent deity that's sort of outside creation in that kind of dualist way. I would say that a lot of the modernist theologians, and, you know, this is in the wake of Marx and Heidegger and other people, in terms of immanence, you know, they wouldn't necessarily use those terms exactly how they're used in philosophy, because I think they mean slightly different things in theology. But, you know, they were more interested in an immanent God who is present in the cultural context or the struggles of people. So you have theologians like Leonardo Boff talking about, he has a really interesting book where he talks about like his father's cigarette and coffee mug as sacramentals, or the things of everyday life that actually bring you grace in like an immanent way through your context, which is very different in some ways than the kind of traditionalist Catholic style of like a total cultural and aesthetic kind of, you know, world that you enter into. So, you know, a lot of those kind of modern Catholic theologians were more interested in, you know, in a kind of a Catholicism that gets very, you know, I wouldn't call it like a little bit avant-garde, but it's a little minimalistic. Like it removes a lot of the extra kind of other stuff and kind of centers in on what this means for you in the midst of your life. So that would probably be the biggest. This is, I mean, these divisions have kind of been, you know, reconciled since then, or other people have done different things with it, but that's kind of what I would say is the big difference.
Yeah, I mean, I could think of like a whole host of questions kind of come to my mind. I could think of a few different ways to go here. It's so interesting. So yeah, I mean, kind of the modernist trend seems in some ways to mirror the tendency of Protestantism in a way, and yet this is a Roman Catholic tendency. Like, how do you see a relationship there with the trend of Protestantism since, you know, the 16th century, I guess?
I definitely think that it's related. I think the difference for a lot of the modernist Catholic theologians is that they were talking more about society than the individual. Okay. So I think this still relates to a kind of predominant Catholic impulse to talk less about kind of the individual's relationship with God and more about kind of your you know, if you're from a marginalized culture, like what is the relationship to God in the experience of your culture? So in Catholicism, culture and society tend to be spoken about more than kind of your personal relationship. So I think that still makes it, in a way, you can see how that Catholicism kind of merging with some forms of Marxism and post-Marx philosophy would result in that. Not so much the kind of like Kierkegaard, you know, it's my individual like leap of faith or something like that. Like that's tends to be less emphasis.
So, I mean, this kind of starts to get into, for me, so like I see like the tendency, like I see Thelema as being very much an outgrowth of that Protestant tendency of where it becomes more and more and more and more individualized, and especially that emphasis on the will, which is such a huge part of Protestantism. And I know that we share this interest in Thelema, so I'm kind of curious how you see those two things going together, one informing the other. How do you see that relationship?
Yeah, I mean, I would say, and I've written a little bit about this recently, is that I kind of see Thelema as a post-Christian kind of like if you were to put it into, I should say it this way, it's not a Christian theology, but if you were to put it into the context of these kind of 20th century theological debates, it has a lot of similarities to some of the things in Death of God theology, which was a form of mostly Protestant Christian theology, also emerging kind of the same time as liberation theology. So in like that soup of mid 20th century contemporary theologies. So I definitely think that Thelema, you know, has that kind of Protestant influence or Protestant culture. I would say though that to me with liberation theology, there are ways to connect them. They're just, both on the level of why it would be a good idea to think about liberation theology,
Okay.
just like in a general sense, and more like really complicated, just kind of thoughts for me that are a little embryonic still. But in a larger sense, just basically the reason some of these contextual theologies are kind of significant, and there are a lot of Protestant forms of them as well. So Black liberation theology really is Protestant comes out of the Black church more than Roman Catholicism. So all the liberation theology isn't just Roman Catholic. But I would say it's kind of ended up being like a pan-denominational theology. And the reason it's important, would just be, again, that Thelema actually has to be able to engage with like issues in people's lives or allow us to, face what is happening in the world or contemporary events and not just be kind of caught up in internal kind of argumentation, which I think I do this too. So it's not, a condemnation, but it definitely needs to go out into the world a little bit. And I think liberation theology is a way of thinking that. And then more specifically, I do think that although Crowley's ideas kind of lend themselves way more to like an individualist, I've been thinking about in terms of individualist anarchism recently, there's some similarities there. I do think that he talks a little bit about the ways in which there are overlapping experiences. So there's a part I think in Magic where he says, a star is an aggregate of experiences. Does that mean everybody has no kind of connection to each other? But he actually says, when somebody, I think he does this in a very like Victorian Englishman way, where he says, if you have a similar upbringing and you're a cultured man, then you're going to have some similar experiences. And then your star will start to overlap with another star. There's actually like a line, I think, that starts to speak about that, which eventually leads to the idea that, if all you are is like identical to the universe, then you overlap kind of with that allows you to then annihilate the universe and gets into all that sort of stuff. But what's interesting about that to me is that there is kind of a shared universe when you talk about class, race, and gender, kind of the structural ways that people are kind of pushed into certain situations and consciousnesses that usually described in Marxism as coming out of the conditions of your culture. I think that you can actually push Crowley into that way in some sense where these stars are overlapping. So whether that's like talking about them in terms of like constellations, Akkad actually uses that in one place, or something like that. I think that Thelema has to come up with a way of talking about structural issues in society, or else it doesn't provide a lot of ways to for the individual to deal with that reality, which I would just say is true. So that's again like why it should kind of engage with this, whether or not you disagree with the specifics.
Yeah, it's interesting because Thelema, I think the way Crowley was constructing it, he definitely had in mind a very intense world engagement, because Thelema is not intended to be an escapist, fantasy. It's even though it does have this very, very strong focus on subjective mystical experience, magical experience, Crowley also says things like, we are related at the very least to all other stars and to the rest of the universe. And the whole point of your incarnation is to get out there and to measure yourself and your differences with other people. At the same time, there's kind of that structural analysis missing to it, right? Because it still is kind of individualistic in the sense that like you are going out and measuring these things, but there's not a lot of talk about how like the way you measure yourself and the way you're going to measure, so many of those ideas are coming from society and might carry with them certain biases or, in some ways reflect the systems of oppression around you. So I could potentially see how the kind of stuff you're talking about could fill in some blanks and maybe make that sort of measuring aspect a little richer.
I would say that there is something you said there is another possible way to take this kind of connection, which is and I know you've had blog posts about this, but about the need for incarnation, that a star has to become incarnate. So I would say that a lot of these kind of contextual theologies are incarnational in their logic, which works in a specific way in Christianity. Obviously, in Christianity, to be incarnational, it has a relationship with the idea of Christ as the incarnation of God. But of course, Thelema has an idea of that too. So, in a lot of forms of liberation theology, when they get kind of broken down into the way that alarms conservatives the most. So like Dr. James Cohen would say in Black liberation theology, Jesus was Black. And that seemed shocking. So, Glenn Beck had a whole chalkboard thing about it once and he's like, what does that mean? How is he black? But it's like, what his point was that Jesus was God incarnate in like Roman occupied Palestine in the first century. And that the experience of being within that context has a relationship like analogically to being black in America, that's Jesus's incarnate location. And therefore theology has to emerge out of that. So Thelema doesn't have that, obviously, but if every man and every woman is a star, then every incarnation's context has to give some sort of kind of theological background to the way you're doing the work. So I would say and this kind of relates again to Crowley's ideas about rights and that I think people have been talking about online lately. So, if anybody who's a Thelemite or anybody, it doesn't because every man and every woman is a star, not just a Thelemite, but if someone is, if they can't really find their will or do their will if in particular systems of structural oppression. So you kind of have to start from the location of the person that's stuck in that if you're actually trying to build a Thelemic world. Otherwise, those people are just kind of left behind. So I know then the next thing is somebody's like, oh, there's the slaves shall serve or something. But I think there's a lot of ways to already read around that. So, yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting. There were one of the conversations that EAO 131 and I were recently having was just these different definitions of true will and how, there's one level where, like you said, it's very much man has the right to think what he will and write what he will and do all of these things. But that's one layer. And at least the way that I look at it is that the other definitions are more like layers that are underneath it that are propping it up. Because by the time your right to do anything is intelligible to you, there's already a whole bunch of other things in place. And you could view that a few different ways. You could view that in terms of supernaturally, but you could view it biologically, which is kind of how I've been going with it. But then Crowley has this thing where he talks about how your true will is your nature. And I'm not really sure what people think about that when they think of nature, but so much of our nature is social. So, I mean, it really does it doesn't close the door at all. It actually opens it completely wide to start bringing in a whole bunch of things like, for example, humans aren't born with the ability to be literate. I mean, they have the ability, right? But they don't have literacy. That's something. But yet our freedom is almost inconceivable without literacy. And at this point, our freedom is inconceivable without having internet access, right? So it kind of opens the door to all of these different layers of, well, what do we even consider nature? Like, what are we incarnating into exactly?
Yeah, I mean, I think that some of those definitions of, and I kind of agree with the true will as nature kind of like at least in a general sense, like to me, that makes more sense than the one that's about finding your like eventual purpose or your free choice or whatever. But I think it does fall into like the Marxist critique again of, you think that this is your nature, but actually it's not really nature. It's actually a construction of the society you're born into. But
that's a really fascinating thing. That does complicate Crowley's point of view of it, doesn't it?
I think that there is a way that Crowley can be read with that, though, which is, Crowley himself, maybe not. Like, again, I don't know. I don't think he would ever agree with this. But I think, Crowley himself speaking about, and I've written a little tiny bit about this, but about adjustment and kind of that gets into dialectics. This idea that, how do I put it? It kind of this notion that everything is in flux constantly. So, and kind of in dialectical flux, which to me, and when I've used the word dialectic, I tend to be thinking about dialectical materialism and Marx and Engels and not Hegel, which I think probably is closer to Crowley in some way. But so just in the sense that there isn't a kind of set nature so much as kind of these, you're born into certain kind of a pathway of experience, and those things shape the star, the aggregate that you are, and that through like adjustment, those things are not like permanent to your nature in some way. I mean, I think that you kind of have to go that way, or else you start to posit some idea of like, your true nature or something, or essence in that way. That I think that that's really getting into this kind of concept about immanence, because I think a lot of liberation theology and a lot of kind of Marxist thought and other things emerge out of an idea that you don't have like a nature that's outside of that social construction. So it's a, whenever you think you're getting back to your true nature, you're really just you're projecting into infinity. So that's Marx's critique of Feuerbach about like, the relationship in society, like the Holy Family is just a reflection of the family that, the nuclear family in our society. So something like that. I think there's ways to go with Crowley in that sense, though. Actually, one thing I wanted to say was that when you're speaking about that is, I believe it's in the Blue Equinox, in his conversation or his document about the structure of OTO, he says in the preface that, and totally like paraphrasing, but he mentions that, in true things, everything is an image of another level. And so man is a microcosm, is an image of the macrocosm, but society is also an image of the macrocosm on a larger scale. So he actually says that directly. And he's talking about it in terms of the structure of OTO, but like a statement that says, you have a human being of microcosm, you have society, and then you have the cosmos, already gives you the ability to move between those levels, including society. So, yeah.
So I'm curious to hear more about the idea of immanence as you're using it. So, when we bring it down to that kind of material level where there's no nature necessarily separate from the conditions that you're born into, like where does that leave religiosity or the experience of transcendence or religious experience? How do you see that fitting in?
Yeah, so I mean, I should say that when I was in seminary, I actually kind of hated where I'm going with this. I thought it was like really annoying. And so I kind of was a little bit orthodox during that time, and would have really wanted there to kind of maintain a more traditional sense of transcendence, because really, one of the critiques is that if you don't have any form of transcendence, you're kind of stuck in your messy situation. Like there's no way out, basically. Right. But I think that some of these philosophies and theologies of immanence, one direction some of them have taken it is that this kind of pure immanence ends up, transcendence doesn't disappear. It kind of emerges out of being like that, so kind of delved into that flux that then like a transcendent kind of experience emerges through that. So less so about the kind of traditional religiosity of, I want to escape this fallen world that's immanent to go to this the world of ideas or heaven or like God, which is outside the world, and much more this idea that it's within kind of these, the immanent experience of the world that I'm actually going to eventually transcend myself. And I think that does have some relationship to Thelema too. I think it also kind of relates to some of these things like in Death of God theology, and that really, Death of God theologians wouldn't say that they're just messing everything up in Christianity. They would say that they're just following the logic of the incarnation to its endpoint, which is that God really became incarnate and then God really died. And so some of the Death of God theologians like Altides are literally, that's their theological position, is there was God became incarnate though, and then God died and God gave up God's spirit to the world. So which creates kind of an immanent form of divinity. So yeah, I think that's, so I think when a lot of these types of theologians use immanence, they're not necessarily saying that there is no transcendent experience, but it's not, you don't achieve it through an escape from the world in some sense. I think that's generally where they're going with it.
Right. So it has to be translated into terms of self-transcendence.
Translated into terms of self-transcendence, yeah. I think usually like kind of the ego. I mean, I think a lot of liberation theologians just aren't as interested in the philosophical side of that, or like that this conversation the same way, like I'm interested in it. But I think that they would be less concerned with, what it means in terms of kind of like dualism or not monism or non-dualism or kind of those concepts. And they're more interested in kind of what it means about your day-to-day experience in struggle, especially. So yeah, it's transcending the ego to some extent, but it's also, it's being immanent within the struggle of your community, generally, is how people would put it. So there is some sense of, connecting up with something larger than yourself. But for example, like one of the really common ways of talking about the resurrection of Christ in this context would be, Christ is resurrected into the community, so into the church, or then into the struggle of your culture. And that gives you warrant to read your culture theologically. So that's kind of the move.
So, I mean, one of the critiques that I've heard of immanence, not in the theological context, but also in the philosophical context, is that it starts to lend itself toward a kind of like pseudo-religious ideology. So like you hear this critique of like Marxism, right? That it has all the energy of religion, but it's not really a religion. It's kind of a counterfeit. How would you address that kind of concern?
I think that's a fair critique on some level. So that's actually probably what I would have said a few years ago. I don't know if there's necessarily a way to say, it's not. I would say that pseudo-religious obviously already has some presuppositions about what's religious or not, for one thing. But I think a lot of these theologians would probably not particularly be concerned with, that critique, in part because part of what they're responding to in terms of like the events of the 20th century was this kind of secularization of society. So I don't think they would necessarily say, this type of theology is like pushing people to be more secular. I think they would say, that's the state of what our culture and experience is. And therefore what we're trying to do is to understand, divinity and, the place of like sacred scripture and other things within that reality already. Obviously some of that kind of gets unraveled with, the fact that religion didn't go away and that there are lots of forms of very conservative, transcendent religion that you could still adhere to. But a lot of these theologians first started writing in probably the 60s, 70s. So it was a little before that revival. I think that's generally the comment. I mean, I do think it's true, though, that you could make an argument that Marxism is like a secular Christian eschatology. That's probably a fair critique. I'm not sure if it's a critique so much as an observation that some people might say, oh, that's a problem. Right. But other people might be like, yeah, it's fine.
It also seems like this goes back to, depending on your interpretation of who Jesus was and what he was about. I mean, there is an interpretation according to which his mission was worldly in that sense, not worldly in the sense that we think, of like Marxism necessarily, but that it had, when he talks about the kingdom of heaven, he meant to establish something here on earth, quite concrete.
I mean, I think so. I come from, the last few years I've worked in specifically in the Poor People's Campaign, which is a movement in the United States that is a revival of Martin Luther King Jr.'s last campaign before he died. And so many people would say, I think, in that community that Jesus was a social movement leader in some sense. So, and especially in terms of like the early Christians holding things in common and kind of creating systems of mutual aid. Like, I think, very explicitly, that's how they read Jesus. I think one thing I did in the book that I wrote that touches on some of these topics is, kind of the interesting thing, if you blend that idea about Jesus with kind of more not so much Thelema, but more kind of Golden Dawn, traditional Hermetic Kabbalah, it kind of does interesting things to your understanding of things like Tiferet. Like if Tiferet becomes like the cosmic Christ or your Christ consciousness or something, but if you're remembering that Christ was incarnate in this situation of marginalization and oppression, then that actually changes what it means to kind of, to achieve that knowledge and conversation of the holy guardian angel, which would have to be in that context. This is more in Golden Dawn. I mean, Thelemites can just be like, who cares about Christ? But I think in more traditional kind of Christian esoteric settings, it does interesting things put in dialogue with each other.
Yeah, so I'm actually glad you went in this direction, because I keep making a note to come back to this whole issue of occultism and how this kind of plays into it, because I think it's very interesting, and I could think of a number of different ways that this might tie in, especially as you're talking about experiencing God in the everyday and in connection with life and with matter. And can you say more about how you see, because occultism, is often this like secretive sort of like niche practice, and for a lot of people it's often like, it's like a fantasy that might not necessarily have a very tight connection with these other things. I'd be really interested to hear how you see that fitting in.
I mean, I think for me, actually, one of the reasons, and this is going to sound funny, but one of the reasons I have moved a little bit from kind of more, when I wrote the book that came out a few years ago, I was really working in a kind of Golden Dawn Christian esoteric context. I mean, I Crowley, I was always interested in Crowley and Thelema going back to, when I first got into this stuff, but for a while it seemed easier to do like a kind of Christian esotericism because it fits my background more. But then actually Thelema to me seemed like it had more potential to connect with, a kind of materialist reading almost of the world from rather than these more kind of Christian, Rosicrucian forms of esotericism. And that might seem funny because I know lots of like the average Thelemite is just as much into like astral kind of stuff as
Right.
like most occultists, but I kind of saw that. I mean, Crowley's idea of, you could almost read him in this kind of materialist fashion, not like a really kind of plain scientistic kind of materialism, but in some of the interesting like speculative materialisms that have come out, in the last few decades, and going back to like certainly the origins of like Hermeticism and its influence on Western philosophy. So I guess saw that there was a potential there, and also this kind of influence in Thelema on this idea that the world is kind of pluralistic in a sense, that there's a lot of, it's just kind of infinite possibility. I saw that as being useful and more open in some ways. So I guess if there's a connection there with the theology that I've studied, it's just that I think Thelema doesn't have to be this kind of closed aesthetic culture that's like a little subculture, but could actually be, open to the world in a way that other forms of occultism don't necessarily have as much access to, because you kind of have to, with the kind of pseudo-Platonic stuff, I would say, which I think most occultism is, you kind of have to accept this, this system of correspondences, like this kind of hierarchy of being, like all this stuff. And then within that, you kind of can do fun rituals and stuff. But Thelema actually seemed like it could push beyond that. Though in reality, as far as who's doing that, it's not, it's a little less, it's less, it's been less successful, but I think it has that potential.
No, that's really interesting that you bring that up, because you did mention a moment ago, like you kind of equivocated about whether Crowley would agree with something that you were talking about. And that kind of raised an interesting question in my mind of like, how important is it, in your opinion, to kind of adhere to what Crowley was saying or to reconstruct what Crowley was saying, versus can we just pull some things out of here and kind of apply it in a different way, maybe that Crowley didn't intend? Like, how do you see that interaction or relationship?
I mean, I think that it's important to reconstruct what Crowley thought, because you need to have some kind of baseline of, understanding. So I've found like your blog really helpful for that. I think that that's a really good take on what Crowley was doing. And then, but I personally don't really have a particular, feeling that you have to adhere much to that after you kind of understand it. And hopefully if you understand it, I do think, this is another thing. And because I come from this background in theology, like people don't adhere to the Bible in a literal way. So, or, nobody's going to be reading, if somebody in these theological conversations, like Augustine said this, it's like, yeah, it's an interesting dialogue partner, but it's not, right. It's important, but it's definitely not like, you don't have to create your entire system on it. So I don't think that you need to just kind of reiterate what Crowley did. I actually think Crowley, and I think some of this is coming out in these recent conversations about things like true will, like Crowley, it's not that he constantly changed his mind, because I don't think he did, but I think that he ultimately wasn't that sophisticated about some of these ideas. He sometimes falls back on like very obvious things from what I would say is like him trying to be respectable in a certain kind of milieu in his like kind of the philosophy of his time. So I don't think you have to stick with that. Yeah, I don't see that. I mean, I think him as a prophet in the idea of the holy texts is a way to think about it. But yeah, I mean, so for me, I mean, I've waffled on identifying as a Thelemite because of some of these conversations. Like, I don't actually want to be too beholden to that kind of like, well, this is what Crowley said. It's like, I honestly don't care that much. But I think, I think you can move beyond that. But I mean, I also think if people don't identify as Thelemites to some extent, who are doing new things, then nothing will happen. So I've tried to identify with it as much as possible recently.
So how do you, what role do you see the Thelemic holy texts playing in just your engagement with divinity, with religious life, or with your activism, or anything really?
Yeah, I mean, I would think of them in a similar way to something like the Bible, honestly. I mean, but I would think of them in similar ways to a text like the Bible, again, in the way that more contemporary religious people and theologians read the Bible, which is not always as a literal kind of statement. So, one of the things that's been spoken about the Bible is the word of God, which is the really common kind of evangelical Protestant way of talking about it. But what you would really say, and I think this comes out of, again, like liberal theology, is the Bible is a record of some people's experience of the word of God that they wrote down. So, right. So it's important. It has a relationship directly with a revelation of divinity, but it's not literal in that sense. So I would still think of Crowley, it makes sense that everything's filtered through kind of his particular understanding. And yet there's the moments where it obviously is like pushing against him in a way that, he's not comfortable with entirely. So I would take it, similar to that. I would take the holy text as having more of like an importance in terms of validity for, writing about Thelema than just Crowley's philosophical works. And then I've found it useful. I mean, the Book of the Law by itself has just been useful to me, in terms of thinking about, and I kind of think about it, my own understanding of it pushes a little towards like a slightly Buddhist way of seeing certain things with the Book of the Law, I would say. So, I mean, just in terms of certain moments, passages like existence is pure joy, I think there's ways to read it that honestly can stand up to like, any holy text of Christianity too, in terms of helping you in the midst of your actual kind of experience, not taken just as like an occult like manual. So
in terms of your engagement with Crowley and applying it and moving it forward, are there any aspects of Thelema as a body of belief that you would say are limiting to the extent that they need to be maybe critiqued more sharply, or even either modified or abandoned?
Oh yeah, maybe. So I'm still kind of on the fence about certain things. This is why I kind of like got really engaged with some of the things that you and I were talking about on Twitter, is because the particular pieces that involve Crowley's attempt to kind of create like a closed system almost, through like the Kabbalistic zero, that kind of what we were talking about in terms of ontotheology, that I have trouble with. And I think that is like a limiting, that's kind of what I mean when I said I'm not sure how sophisticated Crowley is with that, because I think it's pretty open to I think you've been doing this in your blog post, but it's pretty open to the critiques of a lot of kind of advances in like 20th century thinking about some of those issues. So I would kind of question, and the reason I mentioned Buddhism briefly is I'm not expert in Buddhism at all, but I think thinking about, again, reading the Book of the Law without thinking about the idea of like a natural essence is kind of central, and it seems really abstract, but to me, it's actually like a really important piece of interpreting that tradition, in part because I think that the direction of there being like this natural essence to things, or true nature or something like that, or the first cause or whatever that everything's grounded in, can start to quickly kind of close the system, and also tends to start to ground people's identities in a way that I think is not helpful. You see it play out like in terms of like consensus Thelema, you see it start to play out in terms of ideas about like your true nature, or some people who have their true natures, usually people in power, is like, so if you're like white male straight like occultist guy on Reddit or something, like you talk about your true nature and your godhood. But I think for a lot of marginalized people, like those kinds of creating that kind of way of doing identity where it becomes like inherent and immutable in some sense is a problem. So that's some of that, the way, and that may or may not be Crowley's fault, but that's some of the stuff. And then I think like, so I'm just, right before I was on, I've been talking about I was responding to his thread about Kenneth Grant. And so I actually am really a big fan of Kenneth Grant too, which is totally separate conversation. But I do think there's ways to like push Thelema outside of being a positive, kind of a positivistic take on occult concepts in reality, or like this ritual will do this thing, or this writing is a direct like description of reality or something like that, to make it, more of like a negative theology or negative dialectics about those things. I'm doing these things, I can't ever engage with reality without kind of trying to describe it or kind of use a ritual to engage with something. But then the things around that, like that, what it doesn't say almost can tell me more than it. So that may be sort of vague, but I would say like, it doesn't quite get into like a chaos magic thing or a relativistic thing. It's not like anything goes, but it's that you do use like kind of systems or correspondences you've inherited and all that stuff, but to be a little bit less attached to the idea that it's a direct description of reality, I think would be a good thing. And that's probably the way I take a lot of Christian ideas as well.
Yeah, I mean, going along that same trajectory, I mean, a suggestion that I would throw out, and this is just something that I've been thinking about a lot lately, because I have a lot of engagement with dialectical tradition like Hegel and Marx and Adorno and that kind of stuff, and I find those sorts of systems really fascinating. And I think you're right that Crowley was attempting something along those lines, that kind of relationship between parts and wholes, or equivocity and univocity, singularity and manyness. And I see both tendencies in Crowley. I see that systematizing idea of where like God is the whole of wholes kind of thing, where you have like that's the onto-theological side. And I've also seen you try to kind of try to find another angle on that, or another side of that. And I think there is an element there of, you were saying it a moment ago, how I forget exactly how you put it, something about the world being open-ended, the plurivocity of things, the plurality of things. And I think that's in there. That's in there too. And I think that's another way of understanding the dialectical relationship and immanence, where it's not things don't exist to express a singular overarching whole. Right. Things exist in a far more open-ended, ambiguous way. So instead of dialectic in the sense of like Marx or Hegel, maybe dialectic more in the sense of Socrates and like conversations, two people coming together, interacting for a while, being transformed in some way that maybe we don't predict, and then they go off. Right? There's no clear winner or loser of it, and then they, it goes on, and it's more open-ended that way. And I could see that dimension to Crowley as well.
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, I think you put it better than me a little bit in terms of, why I responded this way to that question, because I think like the closedness of that side of Crowley, where he wants to have, he wants to prove himself to be the smartest philosophical thinker who solved all the problems. Like in Bereshit, he says like, I've solved all the problems of all of these philosophers, or something like that.
All of them.
And it's just, I've done it. It's here. This is the solution. And I think that there's, George, I don't know if you're familiar with Bataille at all, but George Bataille, his like constant like obsession with Hegel, or kind of like destroying Hegel or some way, or so just seemingly because like the Hegel, it feels like a closed system, like everything is subsumed into this system. And for Bataille, like the universe is much more open-ended than that. You're kind of wounded in a way, and you can't kind of just subsume it all into this absolutizing system. Crowley to me feels a little bit like Hegel in that sense. I mean, obviously his solution is different, but I kind of go back and forth between thinking it's really beautiful, this idea that everything equilibrates to zero, that's that unity of opposites,
right? And
also thinking that actually closes you off a lot to the possibility that you can't really, make that claim about reality as a closed system in that sense. So I would say that's something that I'm still trying to deal with. So that's why I mentioned like Kenneth Grant. I think there are some post-Crowley writers who you can't take them literally, but they're, pushing the boundaries of some of those ideas and kind of suggesting a more open-ended universe that still draws from Thelema. So, yeah.
I mean, the fascinating thing about Crowley is that on the one hand, you have this like neat sort of dialectical balancing of everything, but then it's like, where do all of the Crowley extravagances and the constant transgression, like this just need to just constantly transgress and cross the boundary? It's almost like there's two sides of his personality there.
Yeah, I mean, in those modes, in like Bereshit, I think he's trying to be taken seriously by kind of, some Oxford philosopher,
Bertrand Russell type, sure.
Yeah, Bertrand Russell. And then I think one of the texts I've really liked is his comments about the ritual of the Mark of the Beast. So Liber 5, I think.
Sure. Yeah.
And so the comments after that ritual, I think, are actually some of his best writing about. So in there, it starts to be this really kind of open-ended dance almost, where it's like he talks about Hadith and Nuit, their union, both, like their union dissolves into nothing, but at the same time it results in the birth of the fool, who still adds up to nothing but his manifestation. And then and this to me is also the kind of beautiful things about like dialectical materialism too, is where reality is this constant, everything is a unity of opposites, everything contains the seeds of its own contradiction, transforms into its opposite, which continues on. So it's just the constant movement is kind of beautiful. And I think that's the cool thing about that form of dialectics that's in Crowley. It actually is not just abstract, but does give you a way of viewing the world that's much more open-ended. So, not actually being able to experience things and realize that, you're not going to find some one truth about yourself or about reality that's going to complete everything, but you actually have to like jump into the flux of reality. I think that's a really cool thing about that perspective. And I think to kind of connect it back a little bit, Marx was talking about dialectics because of social change, not just about an abstract kind of take on Hegel. So, I mean, for Marx and, like Lenin's comments on Marx, Lenin says in his notes on this, like, the unity of opposites, you have plus and minus in mathematics, you have subject and object, and then in society, you have a class struggle is part of the unit. So there actually probably is a way, I don't know if I'll do this, but there is a way to read Crowley in that sense too, where, like a class struggle in society is adjustment on the level of society. Because that's kind of what Marx would say about that to begin with. So, and you can see that a little bit in places like, again, in Crowley's comments on OTO, the office of revolutionary, where Crowley says change only happens through revolution. So there's some constant movement and kind of explosive change all the time in his idea of reality that then kind of gets lost a little bit when everything kind of adds up. Everything just adds up to zero, and then you're kind of done. So there's this, that's for me, that's the keeping the tension of that movement is what is cool about Thelema, and losing it with Crowley saying like, I've solved everything. It starts to be the like sort of sad part.
Yeah, and it's almost like the experience of Babylon is like a counterbalance to that sense of a closed system, right? Because the whole experience of Babylon is about opening, and she's about opening. She's about she's never contained, and then but then you get these weird lines that the magician will master Babylon, and it's like, well, wait, where do you go now? It gets very complicated.
One thing I've read recently, I was reading in Magic Without Tears, in the passages about the left-hand path that Crowley has.
That's a great section, yeah.
It's a good section, but the funny thing that I noticed, I've read it multiple times and just read past it, that his example, and it does touch on society, his example of the Black Brotherhood and the left-hand path ends up being Ireland refusing to be dissolved into England, into Great Britain. And he says, if Ireland is practicing the formula of restriction by not being willing to dissolve into a real live country. And he says a good example of love under will is the melting pot in America, which again is like, there's no critical issue with the way. No,
there was no problem with that. That went very smoothly.
So that to me, I don't think that like undermines Crowley or anything or makes him too problematic or anything like that. But you do have to think like, okay, sometimes when he talks about union, it does kind of edge towards this domination sort of understanding that could be a problem. Like, I think that the fact that those are his examples makes me kind of stop for a second and be like, when he talks about union in other places, then he thinks that this is a good example of this. So yeah, I do think there's ways of reading him against himself, like I think we've talked about a little bit.
So we're coming up on an hour here, and this has just been a really fascinating, wonderful conversation. It's we've covered so much ground here, and there are like so many different threads that I would pick up here and pick your brain about, because we've touched on so much stuff. So, but maybe you can come back in the future, and we can continue the dialogue and talk even more about magic and how that kind of fits in. We touched on it a little bit, and there's just so many things that we could get into. We'll be here for like 3 hours easily.
Yeah, I don't think that I contributed to clarity, but I guess
it was very clear. Actually, it was good.
If it's an open-ended universe, if that's one of the themes, then it's good that we didn't conclude.
So I'm going to put all of your stuff in the description, how to read more about you or read your blog and your book. And I thank you very much for joining me today. It's been a wonderful conversation, and I hope we can pick it up again soon.
Yeah, I love it. I would love to do that. I mean, I really, I hope that was okay.
Oh, fantastic. Yeah.
Okay, good. Yeah, it was, because I think we did talk more about Christian theology than I expected, which I know Thelemites tend to feel weird about, but not you. But I mean, like the viewership, I suppose. But yeah,
I'm not even sure what the viewership is. So, well, I'll find out when the comments come in. But I certainly found it delightful.
When I published that thing about death of God theology on Thelemic union, I think I only checked Reddit once, and I saw EO was like arguing with people on there about, and somebody's like, "There's nothing in Christianity that has anything to do with this. It's just
nothing wrong. At all, nothing."
Like, it was just so I was like, yeah, that's kind of the Thelema Reddit. So
totally.
Yeah, cool. Yeah, it's good to meet you.
Thank you very much for the conversation. And
I'm happy to do it whenever you want.